Welcome to the Mothers on the Frontline podcast. Mothers on the Frontline is a nonprofit organization founded and run by mothers of children with mental health conditions to promote caregiver healing, caregiver justice, and children's mental health justice through storytelling. Please note that we are sharing our experiences as mothers. Nothing on this podcast should be considered medical or legal advice.
In this episode, we will discuss the second principle of the Children's Mental Health Justice Framework. In previous episodes, we discussed Principle 1, and as a refresher, the three principles of the Children's Mental Health Justice Framework are: 1. Children's mental illness, injury, and harms are real and deserving of care. 2. Children's mental health justice and caregiver justice are mutually dependent. And 3, the lived experiences of children, caregivers, families, and communities matter. It is important to note that the Children's Mental Health Justice Framework approaches child well-being as a social justice issue. This framing works to identify and transform things that harm child, caregiver, and family safety, health, and well-being. It seeks to prevent these harms from happening in the first place and to heal damage done to our minds, bodies, souls, children, family, communities, and ancestors. So, second principle, children's mental health justice and caregiver justice are mutually dependent. The first part of that is we are all interdependent. And Tammy, what would you like to talk about on this part of the principle?
Thank you. The fact that we are all interdependent is a very important concept in disability justice. And we accept that in our Children's Mental Health Justice Framework as well. Nobody is independent. Everyone depends on each other for care. We all need to receive care from others. We're born in infancy. None of us just come out of this natural state by ourselves. We are all reared and raised by others. And we need others when we're ill and when we're having difficulty. And we also all care for others. So we're interrelated in these important ways. So we don't equate agency with simply autonomy. We understand that we have individual agency through interrelation with each other. So that's one concept that's important. So let's talk about what that means, because I think it will make it sound very complicated. But really, the idea is that we all depend upon each other. And this is more important for children even, in that young children, there's some central caregiver who's coordinating their care. If a child has health needs, mental health needs, physical health needs, somebody, and it's all too often the mother, it's a majority of times the mother who's coordinating that care. They can't do it on their own because they're a dependent child. They're unable to do that. Although as people get older and teenagers and so forth, they may be able to do more of it. They're still depending upon somebody to coordinate that care for them. So that's one of the aspects that we mean. I'm going to let Deanne talk about this as well, but we'll come back to some of the other ways we're independent. We'll sort of go back and forth because there's a lot to say here.
Well, I mean, I think you hit on a lot of the main elements of it. Some of the other ones that I think are really important, not only in the work that we've done, but I think this is a good point to underscore that a lot of this work comes from our own lived experiences as mothers. And I think that one of the things that, you learn as a mother very early on is that you are, from the time that, especially if you're those of us who have also gestated, right? And so you learn what that interdependence is, like the well-being, and there's so much that's put on you as a gestating person on your role as the caretaker of this growing being, right? And then it's kind of like, then we lose it when we start to talk about systems, right? And our interaction with systems as parents, as children. And one of the things is that that deep relation with the child, right? and that not only is the child not an object, the child is a person in all of this, in their health care, and they are deeply involved. Like what's happening to the child, it should be happening with the child, with the parents' involvement, and that treating everyone like they're sort of segmented parts, right? And you talk about this a lot in your work about silos, right? So there's a silo, there's psychologists, there are psychiatrists, there are, pediatricians, and these are all independent silos, and they also break apart the person, and they break apart the child, and they break apart sort of the family. And so all seeing interdependence as weaving through not only the experience of caregiving, right, but the experience of caregivers as we move through systems that also be interdependent.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying is really important to help us recognize that there are all these individual places that we have to move through, right? And very often they don't talk to each other. They don't work with each other. And as the caregiver, you're the one that's having to communicate with all of them, translate all of it to what that means for you, what that means for your child, translate your child to the school teacher, the doctor, the psychiatrist, everybody, family, community. And you aren't given the support of interdependency, right? Or reciprocity, right? That's another thing we'll talk about more. But highlighting that right now, one of the problems is that we're treated individualistically, and we are not, and we should not be treated that way. Things need to be seen as interwoven and interdependent, and that the communication between all of these things is integral to genuinely healing care for our children.
And I think the last thing I want to underscore about that, what you're saying, Angela, is that siloization that happens, and it's a mind, body, and then institutional kind of siloization, right? So, and we see that kids' behavior, so we start to look at behaviors as these independent things that are not actually a representation or not actually connected to anything that's happening, not only just in health with a child, but could be happening within the community. And reactions, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, like the reactions to and how the pandemic has impacted children's health, not just mental health, but physical health. But then the siloization has a really, it deteriorates the health of the caregiver, because exactly what you're saying, Angela, having to move from one point to the next point to the next point. Like I have to go to a psychologist, maybe a nutritionist, and all of this is working on the same issue. But as the parent and as the parent caregiver, you have to take time away from work. You have to then translate what the doctor said at the last appointment, because a lot of times they're giving contradictory advice. They give medication that overlaps or it's nullifying, and then you need to be believed. And so not seeing this as an interdependent system that is actually working on a person, right, then requires us to do more work, but also it deteriorates our own mental health and our physical health and the time that we have to actually even take care of ourselves.
Yeah, and I know we're going to need to move on, but because we're going to have to go into this much deeper. There's so much more to say about interdependence. But before we do, I just want to mention that what happens is, because these systems are all set up to deal with us as individuals, and they don't recognize the interdependence of the child that they're treating and their family and so forth, as well as all of the elements of that child being interdependent. There's what's going on with them in school, what's going on with their health, their physical health, their mental health, and so forth. The financial well-being of the family gets affected by the health care, whether they can receive it or not. That affects the stress in the family, which then in turn affects the mental health of the family. If a sibling is having a mental health issue, that affects the sibling, which affects their schooling, which affects. So it's really important to understand that. The final thing I want to bring up, which we're going to talk about later, is the stigma is also interrelated.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing my scholarship is showing me is that the history of the concept of unfit mother is tied to the eugenesis past of the concept of the unfit child. The construction of the bad mother and of mother blame happens in the same time and the same context as the construction of feeble-mindedness and of degenerate child, of delinquent child, I'm sorry. And so we will have to talk about that in a future episode, but it's important for us to recognize that that is a social construction that happened in a very certain eugenicist framework that's deeply problematic.
And one more
Yes, go ahead.
thing, because I was looking at my notes and I was like, and this is actually the perfect point, because moving throughout all of this, right? And I know we talked about this on another podcast a while ago, is like, you know, I'm a political scientist. When we talk about neoliberalism, we're usually talking about markets in this big way. But what's really important is this underlying thing of individuality. Like, so to make everything individuated, right? So you have individual markets, individual competition. This is also why eugenesis happens too, right? Because you're not only looking at the impact on, like, can my kid compete? And what is worthy is only that which can compete at a high level and produce, right? Because if I'm producing and I'm competing, then I'm bringing in money. I'm actually able to go and charge more for my services. And so this kind of I want to say neoliberalism in the philosophical thing that's linked to sort of not good collective thinking at all. It really pushes us into thinking about ourselves, our individual units, our individual families. It kind of pulls everything, and my ability to compete, my ability for my children to compete, my ability for my offspring to win is really then tied to all of these concepts of fitness, right?
Yeah.
And that's how all of this kind of starts to intertwine. And I know we're going to talk more about it, but I just thought that that was a good point to kind of up.
Yes,
Bring.
and so much rich information for us to delve into more later. And then now that we've kind of talked about the interdependence, right? The next point to discuss is what children's mental health justice in that does is it's restorative rather than punitive, right? And I think that's something we're going to have to expand on just individually, because there's so much to that, right? And what we do restoratively, and yeah, I don't know, Tammy, if you want to speak on that at all, or what would you like to do?
Yeah, because we're interdependent, we're in relation with each other. And the children's mental health justice framework is restorative rather than punitive, meaning it's to restore relations. When a child is suffering and not doing well, it's to help them, bring them back into healthy relation with themselves, with their family, with their community. If they're having quote unquote behavioral problems, it means there's a relational problem. That's what a behavioral problem is. It means that it's a problem for someone else, right? And so it gets, again, individualized as a behavior, as opposed to there's a difficulty in interaction, right? The child has an unmet need, which is leading to a behavior that's seen as a problem for someone else, when meeting that need can help that restore that relationship so everyone's needs are met, right? There's not something that's considered a difficult behavior for someone else, but that's not coming from an unmet need of the child. So it's about restoring relation. But that idea also, the punitive and carceral view is about removing a behavior, removing a bad child as though it's a contagion. And that goes back to that eugenesis history we'll have to talk about in a future episode. But getting to this notion of care is not a commodity is also very much involved in that individuation, because it treats it as transactional as opposed to relational.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that, or go ahead?
Yeah, I was good. Yeah, so I'm sorry, because that was my fault, y'all, for advancing the screen. I thought you were going someplace else with that, Angela, for a second. But when we talk about a commodity, I mean, a commodity is anything that's kind of useful or valuable, and in an economic sense, or in a policy, or in let me just say, professional economics, right? So in the sense of how we look at it in economics, it would be something like water. It could be anything. Gold is a commodity. Anything that can be divided, priced, sold, right? And so it's sold, and it's usually things that are things that are sold or traded, right? For a price. And so what we're saying is that care, because it's relational and because it is it's not easily divisible. I can't say, even though we attempt to do this, right, with like, having paras, we attempt to professionalize it and commodify it and divide it up and sell it in a marketplace by doing things like, you can hire somebody to come in and I don't know why I put that in air quotes, but you can hire someone to come in and do care, right? And so we pay somebody a per hour rate for whatever they are doing. And this is an attempt to commodify care. But we know that, and the example that was used for me years ago, when I was teaching this, was in like a daycare, right? Like I can actually like say that a kid has to have their diaper changed every 2 hours, right? And so there's all these very complex rules on caring for babies and infants in a daycare setting. But what I cannot commodify is noticing that the child may need to have the child is uncomfortable, or the child may be on the verge of a diaper rash. And maybe what we need to do is be more proactive. There is no way in that per hour rate, and even mandating that 3 diapers are changed in an hour, that I could actually commodify and pay someone for noticing. I can't pay someone for giving that extra juice of love and kisses. We can't commodify that. It's not easily divisible. It's not marketable. I can't even say that I'm getting better value for my money at X daycare over Y daycare because maybe my child gets extra hugs or something, or I appreciated that the way that the caregiver noticed that I was tired and decided to keep my child a little bit longer. This is what we mean by care is not a commodity. I don't know if y'all want to say more, but this is.
Yeah, what you're talking about, and you were the first person to give me a name for it. You're talking about something called anticipatory care, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody knows when they've experienced it, right? You know that, and I'll give an example from my life, and Tammy, you were there for this. My family was moving from Virginia to Seattle, and I was able to invite a group of close girlfriends to my house, and we kind of had a nice little weekend, and we cooked and we talked and we sat out on the porch and we drank and we just had a really nice time. And I cooked, right? And then all of the women came in and cleaned. I didn't ask for it. It was done exactly as I wanted it to, like I would have, had I to instruct somebody, it's exactly what I would have done. And it was a moment that I felt so deeply cared for, mm-hmm. right? It was like, these people know me, they love me, they saw my needs, they anticipated it, and they took care of it without being asked and without payment, right? Yeah. Not expecting me to give something in return. And there's that transaction, right? And transaction can be financial and transaction can be otherwise. I mean, we've all been in therapy, right? And we know that in relationships, a dysfunction can be transactional, right? That you are giving something to get something, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what comes up for me when I listen and, want to expand on what care really is. And for me, that what is genuinely healing care, right? We might need somebody to come and help clean our house, right? But that's totally different than what happened that day with my friends, right? Coming in and caring for me.
I think what's really important to build on that, when we say care is not a commodity, that doesn't mean that care is never needed to be a service, a paid service. When we're talking about children with significant mental health conditions, there is a need for services that must be paid, that should be paid. And we'll talk about the should be paid in the next section. But but what I want to notice about that is that neoliberalism, when we say neoliberalism, what we mean is the idea that competition, profit motive and competition and free market, all deregulated and so forth, is enough to meet all human need, that competition just by itself meets human need. And that there should not be any kind of value other than that competition for profit. And as an early modern scholar, that is not what Adam Smith said or wrote, and that's a whole other thing we could get into in a different podcast. But the invisible hand, that is not what Adam Smith wrote, but that's okay. I will leave that for another day.
People often don't go to chapter 2. They only read chapter 1.
The source, but okay. But why that matters when it comes to mental health, especially children's mental health, is this privatization and this kind of, we're going to save money, which actually ends up costing more money in the long run, oftentimes, because what happens when it comes to healthcare, education, and so forth, is you put people in a situation where they have to care for people. A teacher is caring for their students.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
A nurse is caring for their patients, right? Mental health care provider is working with is caring for their clients. If they commodify the time into such tiny units that they're unable to actually give relational care,
Yes.
the needs of the patient, client, student, so forth are not met. And then you end up with more problems that then end up leading to more problems in the system later.
I think I want to underscore, because you said something, and I think we talk about this a lot, and particularly you were one who really helped me to make this distinction. We have to make the distinction between care and services.
Yes.
Because what we're talking about is, especially when we talk about care economies that become mechanized in a way, we're really talking about service economies. And what happens, and this kind of will get us to that second point, when you have somebody who can actually provide the service, they're not necessarily providing the care. And the care still is, someone is there and someone still needs to be with a child and hugging the child and making sure a child feels reassured when they get their vaccination. The person, the nurse, might be the person who is vaccinating the child and kind of going through, and I'm just using vaccinations as an example, because that's one where there is care. There needs to be some sort of love. There needs to be someone there who is providing, who is taking the child, but also someone who is providing something that is extra than the service, right? And so what we have done, particularly because we are market-based and privatization, what neoliberalism does, number one, is it smushes together and it conflates care with services.
Yes.
Services is what a market can provide. And we can talk later on about neoliberalism, whether or not I think it does a good job, because I got some opinions on that. But we can technically, what is happening, where you see it with nursing aid, or not nursing aid organizations, but businesses that are around providing these services. That's exactly what you're talking about. Even with the services, they squished it down to the minute. It should only take you so long to administer the service. But if that is what we're doing, we're definitely not able, and we're definitely not talking about administering or actually working or in care, right?
Because I want to make sure that we're saying you can be a paid caregiver and still be giving genuine healing care.
Yes.
They're not incompatible. Our system, though, is making them more and more incompatible, which is why people are leaving care providing services, because people do go into these fields because they want to help people.
Yes.
And if they can make a living wage, many people will be motivated to do these things because they want to help people.
Yes.
But it's very as someone who's worked as a nursing assistant for 7 years, that's how I paid for college, right? It is disheartening when you cannot provide the care you know your patients deserve and you want to give them because of the clock that you're put under by being understaffed, for instance. Go
And I
ahead.
know we're going to talk more about neoliberalism, but I want to also underscore what you said about disheartening. This goes back to our first point about relationality. Human beings, we are physiologically constructed towards the collective. We are physiologically constructed towards empathy, towards compassion, and relationality, and to be like this. So it's not just that it is disheartening. This is why so many folks who are in quote unquote caring professions, right, that have been now monetized to service rendering professions only, are not only leaving, but they also report higher rates of mental illness, higher rates of just burnout and exhaustion, higher rates of depression, because exactly what you're saying is it's disheartening, but more than that, it is deteriorating to their mental and physical health to have to administer a service and not actually do what we're hardwired to do, which is also care.
Yes, absolutely. And that moves well into the third point of care is an invisible and exploited part of our economy. And there are many sections of where it is invisible. And maybe we could talk about that first. And I will go as a stay-at-home parent, right? This is one of the most invisible labors that you can perform, right? It is not paid. We can go into that. We can have many episodes just on that and why there's a big problem that is very encompassing. It is hard labor. It's 24/7. There's no vacations, there's no holidays. There's very, very little support, right? It's like you as a stay-at-home parent are supposed to do it all for everybody all the time. And when you have a child or children with medically complex needs, you need community and relationality and that interdependence is stronger, right? And when you have a child that has a mental health diagnosis or some sort of disability that also has stigma attached to it, it's very isolating. And we will talk about that more. But that is one area that our labor is it's invisible, unpaid, and generally undervalued.
And I want to underscore this because you're talking again. We'll talk about this a lot more later in my neck of the woods, which is public policy, and particularly I do gender and public policy. We look at this because there's a feminization of it, meaning that there is a reason why what's happening inside the home. A long time ago, the decision was made to separate what is public and what is private, and that then the things that are private are outside of the realm of any kind of regulation, which means this outside of the realm of the market. And so your care can't be, your care is hardwired at that point into not only your role as a woman, but your role as a wife. And it's just it becomes culturally, and this is one of the things that we're talking about with exploited and invisible. It becomes invisible and exploited culturally too, right? Mm-hmm. Because we create these kind of cultural classifications around gender and around, in this country in particular, around race, and say that certain people are more hardwired and more prone and do it better, right? So you do this better, right, by your gender role of having to carry a child, for instance. So because you've had to gestate and you had to take care of this being there, and because then you have to breastfeed, and this is way, way back, then therefore you're hardwired to do this. And then from a racial standpoint in this country, we have whole classes of people. My grandmother was a domestic worker, and structurally, just because she was locked out and was unable to do any other kind of work. And this comes out of slavery and beliefs that then Black women, women of color, do this better, right? And so, but this is all outside of the market, right? So this is not care, even though, you know, eventually we do pay for caregivers, but this is why people who provide care services are paid at a much, much lower rate than, you know, a construction worker is paid much more than a person who works in a daycare. They're both doing sometimes very similar things, but one is in the market and one has always been like looked at as constructing things, and one has always been looked at as sort of this kind of service that's provided on the side. And all of the elements that make a good, very, very good caregiver are all the things. This goes back to the commodity. We can't commodify that. We know it, but we can't commodify it. And therefore we devalue, because we're market-based. You devalue anything that cannot be easily price tagged and divided. I know you have something to say.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about that, and one thing that the pandemic showed, is that the entire economy rests on the care economy. The care economy is this invisible structure underneath it that holds everything up. And when you don't have childcare, when you don't have elder care, when you don't have disability care, the whole structure falls because employees can't get to work and do all the other things that need to get done. So I just want to point out some statistics. I'm going to be the dry, boring person. I'm going to just give us some statistics, because we do call ourselves mothers on the front line. And while these issues we're talking about are parenting and caregiving issues, it is really important to note that this economic burden that we're talking about does not affect people equally. And as Deanne has talked about, and we'll talk about more in future podcasts, this also racially does not affect people equally. But right now I want to focus on gender. Okay, so women identified folk make up 70% of the global health workforce and do 3 times more unpaid work than men. Mothers are 4 times as likely than fathers to miss work due to childcare, and mothers account for 95% of stay-at-home parents in the United States. That's adults remaining out of the workforce specifically to take care of family members. So while people will often say, but dads do it too, yes, they do, but 5%. Okay, so let's be real here. Similar gender disparities exist among caregivers of person with mental illness. We don't have good statistics on caregiving for children with severe mental illness because it's made even more invisible. It's put under the rug of parenting, which it's much more than parenting. But for instance, we can make some inferences from knowing some things we do know. That a survey of unpaid caregivers of adult persons with schizophrenia in the United States reveals that 82% of caregivers were women, 90% of those being mothers of patients. So we know that that's happening for adult children. We can infer from that and the other statistics what it looks like for who's leaving the job force in a 2-parent family when a child's mental health condition requires it. We know it's overwhelmingly the woman.
Yes.
And this is, I mean, I think that there's some things that, and it reminds me of 2 things. As you were talking about the statistics, even when you're working as a woman, you're still caregiving. I think it was Arlie Hochschild who wrote about the second shift, right? And that was back in the 90s, like late 90s, early 2000s. That book came out. It was supposed to like pop open the lid off of the fact that, and this is just an economic requirement. And it was that case for my grandmother. She was working outside of the home. And so she was giving a lot of her primary caregiving and also the things that were associated with that, the services associated with that caregiving happened outside of the home. But she was also a single parent. So she also had her own kids to care for. And so then there was, and I can't remember, I want to say it was Arlie Hochschild also who did the nanny chain, right? And where she talked about how the caregiver who is providing services at a very, very, very low wage would sort of import that. It's always been predominantly women of color in this country. So overwhelmingly now it is Afro-Latinx, Latinx, and African-American women, but it's always been predominantly women of color who have provided that, which is an invisibilized group anyway, not just in terms of market, but in terms of politics, in terms of everything, representation. And so this is an invisible group providing, as just what you said, the foundational layer. But the thing that we often forget is that our caregivers, particularly when we're talking about feminized or people who identify as women or who we identify as women who are doing this work, they also have caring responsibilities, because it goes back to what Angela was talking about earlier. It's just culturally and socially, women are supposed to be the carers. And so what the Great Nanny Chain talks about is it just basically, then it falls. And this happened in my mother's family with my grandmother, that the primary care role of cooking and noticing and cleaning then usually falls on the eldest daughter, eldest child. And it just kind of goes and it devolves down in that way as we like suck the services and we suck the care in non-livable ways outside of the home. And that's the exploitation part of it. It becomes a systemic exploitation of gendered women. And this is something that's replicated not just here, but worldwide. Like this is a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, I was going to just throw that in. This is a global issue. While we keep focusing on U.S. context, because the three of us are in the U.S. context, colorism of care exists globally because of coloniality. So all across the world, you will find immigrant communities, usually of a darker complexion than the local population, generally giving the kind of domestic care we're talking about and fulfilling the kind of direct care professional roles we're talking about. That's a global issue, not just in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I absolutely look forward to our future discussions as we get deeper into each of these topics. And is there anything you guys wanted to close with before we're done with today's podcast?
No, I mean, I guess for me, this particular principle, it has always hit home because it always reflected not only my personal experiences as a mother, right? And my personal experiences as a wife, even like having to take a step back in my own profession because I'm Black and I'm female and I work and I make less. And so the caregiving decisions that happened in the household happened because of economic realities, that it's better for me to actually do this than my husband, who is not Black and makes more, right? But it also always hit home because of my own family's history. And that part where we talk about people are invisible, like the assumptions, if anything, that anybody gets a takeaway from this is that invisible nature of people who are actually the base and the foundation for everything that we can do, is to actually start to notice that, to value that in our own just daily practices, but in general.
Yes. Notice, value, and start supporting, right? That this one hits really close home for me as well in so many ways, and not enough time today to even get into that. But I would really like for us to leave on the idea that we need support, we need reciprocity, and reciprocity in care and understanding, and so many things that will make us better able to care for ourselves and then care for our families and our communities. And that it's a positive domino effect when we care for women and children and caregivers first.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I would like to end on that. And as always, I love starting my day talking with the two of you, and I look forward to our next conversation. All right. Bye, ladies. Oh, not yet.
You have been listening to the Mothers on the Frontline podcast, copyrighted in 2024 by Mothers on the Frontline. Today's podcast hosts are Deanne Benson-Smith, Tammy Nyden, and Angela Riccio. The music is Old English, written, performed, and recorded by Flame Emoji. For more information on our Children's Mental Health Justice Framework, or to support our work with a tax-deductible donation, go to mothersonthefrontline.org. To listen to more episodes, subscribe to the Mothers on the Frontline podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts.